Alright, we've been bandying about the Cold War for the last few videos, but now it's time to consider the other massive development in this time period, namely decolonization. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. So in terms of decolonization throughout the world, there were two basic means by which nations gained their freedom from their imperial parents, and the first was through negotiated independence, and I've got two examples for you. First, let's visit our friends in India, which, as you may remember, was Britain's most prosperous and valuable colony. As such, they invested a great deal of money to build up India's infrastructure, including railroads and seaports and urban development. Now, all of that investment yielded enormous returns, but all of it was built for the sake of enriching the British Empire and not India. However, that modernization produced the same results in India that it did in other places, namely producing a growing and educated middle class who became increasingly influenced by nationalism and the desire for greater degrees of self-rule. To that end, Indians formed the Indian National Congress in 1885, whose goal was to petition the British government for more of a voice in Indian policy, but those petitions, not surprisingly, were largely ignored by the British. So with that level of snubbing, it may surprise you then that Indians fought by the millions for the British cause in World War I. I mean, they didn't really have a choice about it, but regardless, Indians fought because they believed that such sacrifices would earn them a greater degree of self-rule, but their hopes were again essentially ignored. And so the discontent that followed nearly erupted into violent resistance, especially after British troops slaughtered hundreds of peaceful Indian protesters in the Amritsar massacre. But thanks to the powerful leadership of Indian nationalist Mohandas Gandhi, the imperial resistance movement took on the character of non-violent resistance. And so by the 1920s, in response to that increasing pressure, the British government did transfer some limited authority to the Indians themselves. However, when World War II began, the British again called up millions of Indian troops to fight for their cause, to which the Indians responded, seriously? But they did fight, and once the war was over, Indians demanded their independence, and this time it was a different story. As it turns out, the British were broke enough from the war and had amassed enough pro-independence politicians in Parliament that they officially recognized India's independence in 1947. And hey, before things take a turn for the worse, let me just mention that if you need help getting an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May, you might just want to check out my AP World Heimler Review Guide, which has everything you need to study everything as fast as possible. It's got whole unit review videos that you won't see here on YouTube, note guides to follow along, practice questions, practice exams, and answer keys for every dang bit of it. So if that's something that you're into, check the link in the description. Anyway, India's independent, and that's great. And I wish I could tell you that India's independence marked the beginning of an era suffused with peace and puppies and rainbows. But no. You see, even though the official process of India's independence was negotiated and peaceful, the establishment of India as a new state was fraught with incredible violence, and here's why. So reach all the way back into the brain folds that you developed for Units 1 and 2, and you'll remember that for centuries, India was home to a substantial Muslim minority. And so the Muslims, fearing that they would be marginalized in an independent India, formed a religious and ethnic movement called the Muslim League and called for a new state of their own in the independence negotiation. The result was the partition of India that created the new state of Pakistan and would be the home of India's Muslim minority. But once the two states were created, Hindus fled south while Muslims fled north, and each side committed unspeakable violence against the other. And once the dust had settled, hundreds of thousands, or some estimates say over 1 million people, died as a result. And then the second and shorter example of negotiated independence occurred in Africa, namely the Gold Coast. Now, this was also a colony of Great Britain, and in 1947 an independence movement was led by Kwame Nkrumah. And so as he began negotiations with Britain, the situation was similar to India. No longer was there much public support for imperialism, and Britain was in no position to spend money on quelling rebellions while they were busy rebuilding from the war. Therefore, as a result of the negotiations, the new state of Ghana was born in 1957. Okay, now the second major category for how decolonization occurred was through the process of armed struggle. Now, I can multiply examples of negotiated independence and armed conflict all day, but for the sake of simplicity, let me just tell you what was often the deciding factor that determined whether the process of colonial independence was peaceful or violent. And in many cases, it came down to the size of a colony's white European population. You see, for those colonies in which a large population of European settlers had made their homes, they resisted decolonization, and that resistance caused outbreaks of violence in the name of independence. And let me just give you two examples. First, let's consider the independence movement in the French colony of Algeria. Now, here's the interesting thing. Here in Africa, the French held colonial possessions here in Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria. For Morocco and Tunisia, France recognized their independence through negotiation and without bloodshed. But France would do no such thing with Algeria. And why? White people? You're dang straight, white people. So remember from the previous period that Algeria had been a hotspot of French migration for a long time, and therefore French citizens living there resisted Algerian independence fiercely. And so in 1954, Arab and Berber Muslims responded by forming the National Liberation Front and staged a series of violent attacks against French troops and civilians in the name of independence. And the French went ahead and responded with a brutality that made this struggle for independence among the bloodiest in the period. French soldiers targeted civilians without restraint and committed human rights abuses on a massive scale. And the war continued until 1962 when President Charles de Gaulle opened negotiations with the Algerians and declared the end of the war and Algeria's independence. Okay, the second example of decolonization through armed struggle was also in Africa, namely Angola. So Angola was a Portuguese colony, and by the 1950s, 3 Angolan political groups had joined together to oppose their colonial rule. And violence broke out during a spontaneous insurrection protesting inhumane treatment of farmers by the Portuguese. And as a result, both sides unleashed violence against one another and neither made much progress. However, in 1974, a bloodless coup occurred in Portugal and the Angolans took the opportunity to open negotiations for independence, which came in 1975. And that's great, but like India and so many other decolonized nations, violence immediately followed. Yes, those 3 rival Angolan ethnic groups had united in order to oust the stinking Portuguese, but once they had done it, those groups immediately fell into a civil war to determine which of them would hold power. And since the 3 groups represented communist and anti-communist, the Angolan conflict became yet another proxy war in the larger context of the Cold War. Now, the most basic explanation for why so many colonial independence movements quickly descended into civil war after winning their freedom is because of the problem of colonial boundaries. Recall from the previous period that imperial powers drew their boundaries around their territorial holdings without respect for the various ethnic and religious groups living within them, which was a problem in many places, but none more pronounced than in Africa. In some cases, those boundaries brought rival groups together, and in other cases, those boundaries split ethnic and religious groups apart. And so that carelessness on the part of imperial powers often led to violent power struggles after colonial independence. And though there are countless examples, let me just mention how that phenomenon played out in Nigeria. So in 1960, Nigerians negotiated their independence from Britain, but a civil war broke out by 1967 over who would gain control over the newly independent Nigeria. It began when the Igbo people, who were a westernized Christian people in the south, tried to secede and form their own nation called Biafra. Now, because their land was rich in oil, the northern government was like, "Aw, heck nah," and resisted that secession violently. And ultimately, the North won out in 1970 and established at last a united Nigeria. But the legacy of colonial boundaries in Africa and in various places throughout the world continue to cause tension to this very day. Alright, click here to keep reviewing for Unit 8, and click here to grab my AP World History Heimler Review Guide, which has everything you need to get an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May. I'm glad we got to hang out, and I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.